The screams of a newborn should have filled the small bedroom at the end of the dirt road in San Bernardino, California. But after 16 hours of labor, only the soft weeping of Catherine Reed echoed against the wooden walls. The year was 1876, and this marked her third pregnancy to end in heartache. The midwife, Mrs. Holloway, wrapped the stillborn infant in a clean cloth while avoiding Catherine's eyes, her silence more damning than any words could be. "The good Lord works in mysterious ways, Mrs. Holloway finally said, the platitude falling flat in the heavy air of the bedroom. Catherine turned her face to the wall, feeling the familiar hollowness spread through her chest. 3 babies in 5 years of marriage, and not one had taken a breath in this world. Her husband Edward stood in the doorway, hat clutched between his hands, his expression a mixture of grief and something else, disappointment that made Catherine shrink further into herself. "I'll send for the undertaker," Edward said, his voice lacking the tenderness it once held. He turned without approaching her bed, his footsteps heavy as he descended the stairs. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall. With each passing month, Catherine felt herself becoming more of a ghost in her own home. Edward spent increasingly longer hours at his mercantile store in town, and the few times their paths crossed at home, his gaze would slide away from hers as if her barrenness might be contagious. Word spread through San Bernardino as it always did in small frontier towns. Catherine first noticed the whispers at church, the way conversation would halt when she approached, only to resume with greater fervor once she passed. She began to shop at odd hours to avoid the stares and murmured comments that followed her through town. "Poor Edward," she overheard Mrs. Patterson say to Mrs. Davenport at the general store one afternoon, "bound to a woman who can't give him sons. What's the point of building a future with no one to pass it to?" Catherine clutched her market basket tighter, slipping behind a shelf of canned goods. "My cousin in Sacramento has a similar affliction," Mrs. Davenport replied. "Some women simply aren't made for motherhood. The Lord knows best, I suppose." The words cut deeper than they knew. Catherine had dreamed of children since she was a girl, had named them in her heart, imagined teaching them to read and write, watching them grow. Now those dreams mocked her with each passing month. By winter, Edward barely spoke to her except about household matters. He took his meals in town more often than not, and Catherine heard rumors of him spending evenings at the saloon, something he'd never done during their early marriage. She wondered if he found comfort in whiskey or in the arms of the painted ladies who worked there. Either possibility broke what remained of her heart. On a particularly cold December morning in 1876, Catherine woke to find Edward packing a small valise. "The mercantile needs supplies from Los Angeles," he said without meeting her eyes. "I'll be gone a week or so." Catherine nodded, her throat too tight for words. They both knew it wasn't supplies he sought. When he left without kissing her goodbye, she sat on their bed for hours, staring at the empty space he'd left. 3 days later, she received a letter delivered by a somber-faced deputy. Edward's stagecoach had been attacked by bandits in the mountain pass. There had been no survivors. Catherine read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. She was now a childless widow at 24. The funeral was held in the small church at the edge of town. Catherine stood alone as they lowered Edward's coffin into the ground, aware of the whispers behind her. "Cursed," someone murmured. "First her babies, now her husband." "Edward should have found himself a proper wife years ago," another voice added. "Now his family line ends with him." Catherine endured the reception at her home afterward, accepting cold condolences from neighbors who seemed more concerned with what would happen to Edward's store than with her grief. By evening, when the last visitor departed, She sat alone in the parlor wondering what remained for her in this life. In the weeks that followed, Catherine learned that Edward had mortgaged their home to expand the mercantile. The bank manager, Mr. Finch, informed her with thinly veiled satisfaction that she would need to either take over the business or sell everything to cover the debts. Of course, a woman alone can hardly manage a business, he said, adjusting his spectacles. I know several interested parties who might make you a reasonable offer for the store, enough perhaps to secure you passage back east to any family you might have. Catherine had no family left. Her parents had died of influenza when she was 17, and her only brother had been killed at Gettysburg. There was nowhere to go. I will need time to consider my options, she told Mr. Finch, straightening her spine against his dismissive gaze. That night, she stood in the mercantile after closing, looking at the shelves Edward had stocked, the ledgers he had kept. She knew nothing of running a business. Women in San Bernardino didn't own businesses. They were wives and mothers, or they were spinsters who lived on the charity of relatives. Catherine was neither. The next morning she opened the store as Edward would have, her hands shaking as she turned the key in the lock. The bell above the door jangled, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. The first customer was Mrs. Holloway, the midwife who had attended all three of Catherine's failed births. The older woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Mrs. Reed, I hadn't expected to find you here." "The debts must be paid," Catherine replied simply, moving behind the counter. "What can I help you with today, Mrs.?" Holloway hesitated before requesting thread and needles. As Catherine wrapped the purchases, the midwife leaned forward. "You understand this isn't proper. A young widow running a store alone. People will talk." "People already talk, Mrs. Holloway," Catherine responded, her voice steadier than she felt. "I found their words can't kill me, though they certainly try." Word spread quickly that the barren widow Reed was operating her husband's store. Some customers stopped coming altogether. Others came solely to gawk, purchasing little. By the end of the first week, Catherine knew she wouldn't last a month at this rate. On a rainy Tuesday, when not a single customer had entered the store, Catherine heard the bell jingle and looked up to see Sheriff Davis filling the doorway, his imposing frame dripping onto the floorboards. "Mrs. Reed," he nodded, removing his hat. "Thought I'd check in on you. Town's concerned." "The town's concern is overwhelming," Catherine replied dryly. "Yet it doesn't seem to translate to patronage." The sheriff smiled slightly. "Folks don't know what to make of your situation. It's unusual. Being widowed or being barren?" Catherine asked bluntly. "Because neither seems particularly rare on the frontier." Sheriff Davis coughed uncomfortably. "Running a business, madam, it's not proper." "Yes, I've been informed," Catherine sighed. "Is there something you needed, Sheriff, or did you just come to advise me on propriety?" Before he could answer, the bell jangled again, and a tall stranger ducked through the doorway. The man was drenched from the rain, water streaming from the brim of his hat. He nodded at the sheriff before turning to Catherine. "Pardon the intrusion," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow matched his rain-soaked appearance. "My wagon threw a wheel about a mile out, and I need supplies to fix it before nightfall." Catherine straightened. "Of course. What do you require?" As she gathered nails, rope, and tools, she was aware of the sheriff's eyes following her movements. The stranger, however, seemed focused only on his immediate problem, explaining his situation as she worked. "Name's Thomas Irwin," he said. "Traveling through on my way to my brother's ranch north of here. Got caught in this downpour and hit a rut in the road." "Irwin," Sheriff Davis squinted. "Any relation to Robert Irwin over at Whitewater Creek Ranch?" "My brother," Thomas confirmed. "Finally taking him up on his offer to join him out west." Spent the last 15 years in Colorado territory working various outfits. Time to put down roots, he says. Catherine wrapped the purchases in brown paper, feeling a strange sense of calm in the presence of this straightforward stranger who treated her like any shopkeeper, not like a curiosity or a subject of pity. "That'll be $1.35, she said. Thomas counted out the coins and thanked her. As he gathered his purchases, he glanced out at the worsening storm. "Looks like I might be spending the night fixing that wheel," he observed. "Is there a hotel nearby?" "The San Bernardino Hotel is just down the street," Catherine replied. "Though it's more of a boarding house than a proper hotel." Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. "Mrs. Tenley runs a clean establishment. I can show you the way, Mr. Irwin." The men departed, and Catherine was left alone again with the sound of rain on the roof and the ledger that showed increasingly poor sales. By closing time, she had made only $2.18, not enough to keep the doors open much longer at this rate. The next morning dawned clear and crisp after the storm. Catherine arrived at the store early, sweeping the boardwalk and arranging the window display with a desperate hope that today might bring better fortune. As she worked, she noticed a wagon being pulled up in front of the store. Thomas Irwin sat on the driver's bench, looking considerably drier than the day before. He tipped his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Reid, good morning to you." "Mr. Irwin," she acknowledged, "I see you managed to repair your wheel." "That I did, though I'm afraid I broke one of your tools in the process." He held out a hammer with a cracked handle. "I'd like to pay for the damage and perhaps purchase a replacement." Catherine led him inside, where he examined the tools available. As she wrapped his new purchases, he leaned against the counter, his gaze direct but not unkind. "Sheriff mentioned you've been running this place on your own since your husband passed. That can't be easy." Catherine stiffened. "Did he also mention all the other fascinating details of my situation that the town enjoys discussing?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "He might have said there's been some talk. Frontier towns run on gossip more than gold, in my experience." Despite herself, Catherine smiled slightly at that. "Well, your experience seems accurate enough." Thomas paid for his purchases, then hesitated before turning to leave. "I noticed you have quite a stock of leather goods. My brother's ranch hands are always in need of new gloves and belts. I could bring them by to look at your inventory if that would help business." The offer was so matter-of-fact, with no hint of pity, that Catherine found herself nodding. "That would be most helpful, Mr. Irwin. Thank you." He tipped his hat again and left. Catherine tried not to feel hopeful one potential customer wouldn't save her store, but it was the first positive interaction she'd had in weeks. True to his word, Thomas returned 3 days later with 4 ranch hands who purchased gloves, belts, tobacco, and various sundries. The men treated her with polite respect, following Thomas's lead. As they were leaving, Thomas lingered behind. "Your mercantile carries good quality goods," he observed. "Shame the town isn't supporting it properly." Catherine busied herself with the ledger. "The town has its opinions about a woman's place, and this isn't it." "Their loss," Thomas replied simply. "I'll be staying at my brother's place for some time. Reckon I'll be by again for supplies." Over the next month, Thomas became a regular customer, often bringing ranch hands with him or picking up orders for the Whitewater Creek Ranch. Each visit was characterized by the same straightforward courtesy, free from the judgment Catherine had grown accustomed to. Sometimes he would linger, asking questions about inventory or making suggestions about items the ranch might need. Catherine found herself looking forward to his visits. Thomas stood well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. His face was weathered from the sun, with deep laugh lines around his eyes that hinted at a good nature beneath his reserved demeanor. He never mentioned her status as a widow or the rumors that followed her. They spoke of business, the weather, occasionally books when he noticed her reading during quiet moments in the store. It was during one of these conversations that Mrs. Holloway entered the store, stopping short at the sight of Catherine smiling at something Thomas had said about a particularly stubborn horse on his brother's ranch. "Mrs. Reed," the midwife greeted, her tone cool. "I need laudanum for Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism." As Catherine fetched the medicine, she was acutely aware of Mrs. Holloway's disapproving glances between her and Thomas. When she returned with the small bottle, the midwife leaned close. "A respectable widow observes mourning for at least a year," she whispered harshly. "Entertaining men alone in your store invites speculation about your character." Catherine felt her cheeks burn. "Mr. Irwin is a customer, nothing more." "See that it remains so," Mrs. Holloway replied, "though given your condition, I suppose you have little to fear from impropriety in that regard." The casual cruelty of the remark struck Catherine like a physical blow. She was still standing frozen when Mrs. Holloway departed, the bell jingling with a finality that echoed in the sudden silence. "Mrs. Reed." Thomas's voice broke through her shock. "Are you unwell?" Catherine blinked rapidly, willing away the tears that threatened. "Quite well, thank you. Was there anything else you needed today, Mr. Irwin?" Thomas studied her for a long moment before answering. "I believe I have everything I came for. Good day to you, Mrs. Reed." After he left, Catherine closed the store early and retreated to her empty home, where she finally allowed herself to cry. Mrs. Holloway's words had cut deep, reminding her of what she tried so hard to forget, that in the eyes of society, her worth as a woman was measured by her ability to bear children, a test she had failed repeatedly. The following week passed without a visit from Thomas. Catherine told herself it was for the best. The last thing she needed was more fuel for town gossip. Yet she found herself watching the door each time the bell rang, hoping to see his tall frame fill the doorway. When he finally did return, it was late afternoon on a quiet Friday. Catherine was tallying the day's meager sales when the bell announced his arrival. He looked different, somehow freshly shaven, wearing a clean shirt beneath his usual leather vest. "Mrs. Reed," he greeted, removing his hat. "I hope I find you well." "Mr. Irwin," she replied, suddenly conscious of her work-worn hands and simple dress. "What can I help you with today?" "Actually," he said, shifting his weight slightly, "I came to ask if you might join me for supper at the hotel dining room this evening." Catherine stared at him in shock. "Supper? With you?" "Yes, madam," he confirmed, a hint of amusement in his eyes at her surprise. "Unless you have other plans." "Aye, that would be." Catherine hesitated, thinking of Mrs. Holloway's warning of the gossip that would surely follow. "Mr. Irwin, while I appreciate the invitation, I'm not sure that would be wise." "Because you're in mourning?" he asked directly. "Partially," she admitted. "And because this town already has enough to say about me without adding impropriety to the list." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. Perhaps another time when circumstances are more favorable." He reached for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Reed, I've never put much stock in what people say. I prefer to judge for myself." With that, he departed, leaving Catherine with the distinct feeling that she had just turned away something important, though she couldn't quite name what it was. 2 days later, Catherine was closing the store when she heard raised voices from the saloon across the street. Such disturbances weren't uncommon in San Bernardino, but what caught her attention was hearing her own name mentioned. She hesitated by the window, partially hidden by the curtain, and listened. "Reed's widows got no business running that store," a slurred voice declared. Unnatural is what it is. Woman who can't even provide sons trying to do a man's job. Heard she's setting her cap for that new rancher, the one from Colorado, another voice added. Poor fellow probably doesn't know what he's getting into. Barren woman's about as useful as A. The rest of the crude comparison was cut off by the sound of a chair scraping back violently. That's enough. The voice was Thomas's, hard as flint. Mrs. Reed is a respectable businesswoman and a grieving widow. You'll keep civil tongues in your heads when speaking of her. Or what, Cowboy? The first voice challenged. You sweet on the barren widow, planning to waste your life on a woman who can't give you children. There was a sudden crash, followed by shouts and the unmistakable sounds of a fight. Catherine backed away from the window, her heart pounding. Within minutes, several men spilled out onto the street. Among them was Thomas, his lip bleeding and his knuckles raw, being restrained by two other men while a third, one of the town's more notorious troublemakers, was being helped to his feet, blood streaming from his nose. Sheriff Davis arrived quickly, restoring order and escorting the bloodied man away after a brief conversation with Thomas and the others. Catherine retreated to the back of her store, not wanting to be seen. She was sitting in her small office when a knock came at the store's back door. Cautiously, she approached, calling out, "Who's there?" "Thomas Irwin, madam." Catherine unbolted the door to find Thomas standing there, his hat in his hands and a bruise forming along his jawline. "Mr. Irwin," she gasped, "what happened to you?" "A disagreement about proper manners," he replied, a slight smile playing at his split lip. "May I come in for a moment?" Catherine hesitated before stepping back to allow him entry. In the lamplight of her small office, his injuries looked worse. A cut above his eyebrow joined the split lip and bruised jaw. "Sit down," she instructed, retrieving the medical supplies she kept on hand. "Those cuts need cleaning." Thomas complied, watching silently as she dampened a cloth and began to gently clean the blood from his face. "You heard what happened," he said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Enough," Catherine admitted, focusing on her task to avoid meeting his eyes. "You shouldn't have gotten involved. Their opinions of me are well established." "And they're wrong," Thomas replied firmly. "No one speaks that way about a lady in my presence." Catherine's hands stilled. "Is that what this was? Defending a lady's honor?" "Partly," he conceded. "But more than that. I've been watching you these past weeks, Catherine. You're running this store with more dignity and determination than most men I know could muster in your situation. You don't deserve their scorn." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. "Their scorn is based on truth," she said quietly, resuming her ministrations. "I failed at the one thing a wife is supposed to provide. 3 babies, Thomas. 3 little souls who never took a breath in this world." Thomas caught her wrist gently as she dabbed at his cut. "That doesn't make you less. It makes you someone who's endured more sorrow than most could bear, yet still stands tall." Catherine pulled her hand away, turning to rinse the cloth. "The town doesn't see it that way. They see a defective woman playing at being a shopkeeper." "Then the town is blind," Thomas said simply. When she turned back, he had risen from his chair and stood closer than she expected, his presence filling the small room. "Why are you here, Mr. Irwin?" Catherine asked, suddenly very aware of their isolation and impropriety of the situation. "Because I think you're remarkable," he answered honestly. "And because I'd like to know you better if you'd allow it." "To what end?" she challenged, her defenses rising. "I'm a widow of less than 6 months. I'm struggling to keep this store afloat. And as the town is so fond of reminding everyone I cannot have children, what possible interest could you have in such a situation?" Thomas didn't back away from her directness. My interest is in you, Catherine Reed. Not your status as a widow, not your business, and not your ability to bear children. Just you. The simplicity of his statement left her speechless. For so long, her value had been tied to her role as wife and potential mother. Even Edward, who had once claimed to love her for herself, had eventually viewed her through the lens of her failures. "You don't know me," she finally said. "I'd like to," he countered. "Properly, with the town's gossip be damned. Have dinner with me tomorrow evening. I'll arrange for it to be at your home, with my brother's wife as chaperone if that eases your concerns about propriety." Catherine studied him, the earnest expression, the bruises he'd earned defending her name, the steady gaze that held no pity, only warmth. "Very well," she agreed softly. "Dinner tomorrow." Thomas's smile transformed his face despite his injuries. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she confirmed. After he left, Catherine leaned against the closed door, wondering what she had just agreed to and why her heart felt lighter than it had in months. The following evening, Catherine found herself fussing over her appearance for the first time since Edward's death. She chose a dress of deep blue that she hadn't worn in nearly a year, one that Edward had always complimented. Her hair, usually pulled back in a simple knot for work, she arranged in a more becoming style with soft curls framing her face. At precisely 7, a knock came at her door. Thomas stood on her porch alongside a friendly-looking woman in her 30s who introduced herself as Margaret Irwin, Robert's wife. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mrs. Reed," Margaret said warmly. "Thomas has spoken highly of your mercantile and your resilience in running it alone." Catherine ushered them into her modest home, where she had prepared a simple but hearty meal. The conversation flowed more easily than she had expected, with Margaret sharing stories of her own adjustment to frontier life after growing up in Boston. "The first year was dreadful," Margaret confessed with a laugh. "I had no idea how to cook over an open fire or deal with the isolation. Robert nearly sent me back east twice." "What made you stay?" Catherine asked, genuinely curious. Margaret's expression softened. "Love, primarily. And stubbornness. I refused to be defeated by circumstances, no matter how challenging." Thomas watched Catherine throughout the evening with an attention that might have made her uncomfortable if it hadn't been so respectful. He asked questions about her life before San Bernardino, listened intently to her answers, and shared his own experiences working on ranches throughout the Colorado Territory. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret tactfully suggested they should return to the ranch before it grew too late. "Perhaps we could convince Mrs. Reed to join us for Sunday dinner at the ranch next week," she suggested to Thomas. "The change of scenery might be refreshing after running the store all week." "I would be delighted if you would come," Thomas said, looking to Catherine expectantly. "That's very kind," Catherine replied. "I'd be pleased to accept." After they departed, Catherine sat in her quiet parlor, reflecting on the evening. For the first time in months, she had spent hours without thinking about her losses or the town's judgment. In Thomas's presence, she felt seen for herself, not as Edward's widow or as the barren woman, but simply as Catherine. The week passed with a new energy. Catherine tackled the store's inventory with fresh determination, rearranging displays and taking stock of what items sold best. Thomas visited twice, once to purchase supplies and once, unexpectedly, to bring her a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. "I noticed you reading Emerson last week," he said, handing her the slender volume of Wordsworth. "Thought you might appreciate this as well." The gesture touched her deeply. Edward had never shown interest in her reading, considering it a distraction from household duties. Sunday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures unusual for February. Thomas collected Catherine in a buggy, and they rode the 5 miles to Whitewater Creek Ranch in comfortable conversation. The ranch sprawled across several hundred acres, with a handsome main house built of sturdy logs and stone. Robert Irwin, a broader, older version of Thomas, welcomed her with the same direct courtesy his brother showed. His 3 children, 2 boys of around 10 and 12, and a girl of perhaps 7, regarded her curiously before being shooed away by their mother to wash up for dinner. "They're not used to visitors," Margaret explained, "especially pretty ones who make their uncle smile." Catherine blushed at the implication, but found herself enjoying the lively family dinner that followed. The children asked her countless questions about life in town, and Robert and Thomas discussed ranch business with a comfortable familiarity that spoke of their deep bond despite years spent apart. After the meal, Thomas suggested showing Catherine the property. Margaret provided her with a shawl against the afternoon breeze, and they set off toward a small creek that gave the ranch its name. "Your brother has built something remarkable here," Catherine observed as they walked. "It's clear how much he loves this land and his family." Thomas nodded. "Robert always knew what he wanted. I envied that certainty when we were younger." "And now?" Catherine asked, glancing up at him. "Now I'm beginning to understand it," he replied, his gaze steady on hers. They reached the creek, where willows bent over the water and birds called to each other from the branches. Thomas helped her to a seat on a fallen log, remaining standing as if too restless to sit. "I have a confession to make," he said after a moment's silence. "When I came to San Bernardino, it wasn't just to join Robert. I was running from something." Catherine looked up at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" Thomas paced a few steps, hands clasped behind his back. "Back in Colorado, I was engaged to be married. Helen was the daughter of the ranch owner where I worked as foreman. She was beautiful, educated back east, used to finer things than a cowhand could provide, but she claimed to love me, and I believed her." He paused, his expression clouding. 3 weeks before the wedding, I found her in the arms of a banker from Denver. When confronted, she admitted she'd never intended to go through with marrying me. I was a temporary amusement, nothing more." Catherine felt a surge of indignation on his behalf. "That's terrible." "It was," he agreed. "But what was worse was realizing I'd been blind to the truth. Helen had always treated our engagement as something slightly amusing, the rough cowboy and the refined lady. I was too flattered by her attention to see I was being played for a fool." "So you came west to escape the humiliation," Catherine surmised. Thomas shook his head. "Not just that. I came to start fresh, yes, but also because I needed to rediscover what I truly valued. The experience made me question my judgment." "And have you?" Catherine asked softly. "Rediscovered what you value?" Thomas turned to face her fully. "I believe I have. Honesty, courage, strength of character, the very qualities I've witnessed in you since the day we met." Catherine felt her cheeks warm under his sincere gaze. "You give me too much credit. Most days I'm simply trying to survive." "That's where you're wrong," Thomas said, stepping closer. "Survival alone would mean selling the store, retreating from public view, living on whatever charity the town might offer a widow. Instead, you face their judgment daily, holding your head high despite their cruelty. That's not mere survival, Catherine. That's courage." His words wrapped around her heart like a balm. For so long she had seen herself through the town's eyes, a failure as a woman, an object of pity and gossip. Thomas saw something else entirely. "May I call on you properly?" he asked suddenly. "Not as a customer or a friend, but as a man interested in courting you." Catherine's breath caught. "Thomas, you know what they say about me, what I cannot give you." "I'm not asking for anything except the chance to know you better," he replied. "The rest we'll face together if the time comes." Standing there by the creek, With the afternoon sun filtering through the willows, Catherine made a decision. She had spent months defined by her losses. Perhaps it was time to define herself by something else, by the possibility of new beginnings. "Yes," she said simply. "You may call on me." The smile that broke across Thomas's face was like sunrise after a long night. He took her hand and brought it briefly to his lips, a gesture so gentle it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. They walked back to the house in a comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing in a way that sent warmth spreading through Catherine's chest. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something like hope taking root inside her. The following weeks saw Thomas calling on Catherine regularly. He would arrive at the store near closing time, sometimes helping her with final tasks before escorting her home. On Sundays, she joined the Irwin family for dinner at the ranch. Gradually, the townspeople grew accustomed to seeing them together, though the whispers never entirely ceased. "He'll realize his mistake soon enough," Catherine overheard Mrs. Patterson say one morning as she arranged fabric bolts. "What man wants a barren wife when there are plenty of young, fertile women in the territory?" Catherine had learned to steel herself against such comments, but they still stung. In her darkest moments, she wondered if Mrs. Patterson was right, if Thomas would eventually want what she couldn't give him. Each time these doubts surfaced, however, Thomas seemed to sense her withdrawal and would find ways to reassure her through small gestures and unwavering attention. One evening in late April, after closing the store, Catherine found Thomas waiting with a picnic basket and a suggestion they eat by the small lake just outside town. The spring weather was perfect for dining outdoors, and Catherine gladly accepted. As they spread a blanket beneath a large oak tree overlooking the water, Thomas seemed unusually thoughtful. "Is something troubling you?" Catherine asked as she laid out the simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold chicken that Thomas had brought. Thomas sat beside her, his gaze on the lake's shimmering surface. "I had a letter from my former employer in Colorado. He's offered me my old position back, with increased pay and partial ownership of the operation." Catherine's heart sank. "I see. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity." "It is," Thomas agreed, "or it would have been a few months ago." "And now," Catherine ventured, hardly daring to hope. Thomas turned to her, his expression serious. "Now I have reasons to stay that far outweigh any professional advantage elsewhere." Relief washed through her, followed by a wave of guilt. "I wouldn't want to be the reason you declined a good position, Thomas." "You're not the reason I'm declining," he corrected gently. "You're the reason I'm choosing a different path. There's a distinction." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "I've been carrying this around for a week, waiting for the right moment. I'm not sure there is one perfect moment, but this place seems fitting." Catherine's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically, "but neither are we, I suppose." "Thomas," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Catherine Reed," he said, taking her hand, "I love you. Not despite your past, but including it. Every joy and sorrow that shaped you into the woman you are today is precious to me because it brought you here to this moment. I'm asking you to be my wife, to build a life with me here or elsewhere as we choose together." Tears filled Catherine's eyes. "You know I may never be able to give you children." Thomas's grip on her hand tightened. "I'm not asking you for children. I'm asking for you, your heart, your companionship, your partnership in whatever life brings us. That's enough. You are enough." The words broke something open inside Catherine, a dam holding back grief and shame and the desperate longing to be loved for herself alone. Tears spilled down her cheeks as Thomas reached up to brush them gently away. "Yes," she managed through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger before gathering her into his arms. His kiss was tender, a promise of all the words he'd spoken and more. When they finally broke apart, Catherine rested her forehead against his. "The town will talk." "Let them," Thomas replied simply. "Their opinions matter far less than our happiness." The wedding took place in June at the Whitewater Creek Ranch, with Robert serving as best man and Margaret as Catherine's matron of honor. A handful of ranch hands and their families attended, along with Sheriff Davis, who had become something of an ally to Catherine after witnessing the town's treatment of her. Notably absent were most of San Bernardino's prominent citizens, including Mrs. Holloway and the Pattersons, all of whom had declined the invitation with poorly disguised disapproval. Catherine found she cared less than she might have expected. Standing beside Thomas as they exchanged vows, she felt a sense of rightness that transcended the opinions of others. They established their home in a small cabin on the edge of Robert's property, close enough to town that Catherine could continue running the mercantile, while Thomas took on increasing responsibilities at the ranch. Their days fell into a comfortable rhythm, mornings spent sharing coffee before heading to their respective work, evenings reuniting to share the day's events over dinner. The first true test of their marriage came in August when Catherine's monthly cycle arrived, dashing the quiet hope she had harbored that, perhaps, with a different husband, her body might finally cooperate. She sat on the edge of their bed that night, clutching a handkerchief and fighting tears when Thomas found her. "Catherine," he knelt before her, concern etched across his features. "What's wrong?" "I'm not. We're not." She struggled to find the words. "I'm not expecting." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Oh, my love. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that it might be different this time," she confessed, the tears finally spilling over. "That whatever was wrong before might have been." "Catherine," Thomas interrupted gently, taking her hands in his. "Nothing is wrong with you, nothing. But I want to give you a family," she whispered brokenly. Thomas moved to sit beside her, pulling her close against his side. "We are a family, you and I. If children come, they will be a blessing. If they don't, we will still have a full and meaningful life together." "How can you be so certain?" she asked, looking up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "Because I've seen men with a dozen children who are desperately lonely," he replied. "And I've known couples without children whose lives are rich with purpose and love. It's not the number of people in a home that makes it a family, Catherine. It's the love that fills it." In the months that followed, Catherine gradually came to accept that her worth wasn't tied to her ability to conceive. The mercantile flourished under her careful management, eventually requiring her to hire an assistant, a young widow named Sarah, who had recently lost her husband to pneumonia and needed work to support herself. Thomas proved a natural partner in Robert's ranching operation, his years of experience in Colorado bringing new techniques and ideas that expanded the ranch's productivity. By their first anniversary, they had saved enough to begin construction on a larger home of their own on a parcel of land Robert sold them at the far edge of his property. One evening, in early spring of 1878, Thomas returned from town with a strange expression on his face. "What is it?" Catherine asked, setting aside the ledger she'd been reviewing. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Thomas replied, removing his hat and coat. "Mrs. Holloway stopped me in town today. She asked about you." Catherine raised an eyebrow. The midwife had barely acknowledged her existence since her marriage to Thomas. "What did she want?" She said, "There's a situation she thought might interest us." Thomas sat beside Catherine at the table, taking her hands in his. "A young woman, unmarried, arrived in town last week. She's expecting a child and plans to give it up once it's born." Catherine's heart stuttered. And Mrs. Holloway thought of us. Thomas nodded slowly. She said that while she still believes a woman's worth lies in bearing children, she's come to respect the way you've built a life despite your circumstances. She thinks we would provide a good home for this child. Tears filled Catherine's eyes. After all her judgment, all her cruel words. "People can surprise us," Thomas said softly. "Sometimes even change." "What did you tell her?" Catherine asked, hardly daring to hope. "I said I would discuss it with my wife, but that we would be honored to be considered." Thomas squeezed her hands. "The choice is ours, Catherine, together." That night, they talked for hours about what taking in a child would mean, the adjustments to their lives, the potential complications, the joy and challenges of raising a child not born to them. By morning, their decision was made. The young woman's name was Emily, barely 18 and traveling west to join her aunt in San Francisco, when she had fallen ill and been forced to stop in San Bernardino. Her pregnancy was the result of a brief relationship with a young man back east who had promptly abandoned her when he learned of her condition. With no resources and a disapproving family, she had determined that giving up the child was her only option. Catherine met her at Mrs. Holloway's home, where the midwife had arranged for Emily to stay until the birth. The girl was thin and frightened, her swollen belly incongruous with her childlike face. "Mrs. Irwin," Emily greeted her nervously. "Mrs. Holloway said you and your husband might. That is, that you're considering taking in your child as our own," Catherine finished gently. "Yes, we are." Relief flooded Emily's features. "You seem kind. I want my baby to have kind parents." Over the following weeks, Catherine visited Emily regularly, bringing food and small comforts from the mercantile. They talked about Emily's plans to continue to San Francisco after the birth, and about the dreams she had for her own future, dreams that didn't include motherhood, at least not yet. "I feel terrible sometimes," Emily confessed during one visit, "like I'm abandoning my responsibility. But I'm not ready. I can't give this baby what it needs." "By recognizing that," Catherine reassured her, "you're being more responsible than many parents who keep children they can't properly care for. You're giving your child its best chance." The labor began on a stormy night in late April. Thomas rode through the downpour to fetch Mrs. Holloway while Catherine stayed with Emily, holding her hand through contractions that racked her slight frame. Unlike Catherine's own labors, this one progressed swiftly. By dawn, the cries of a healthy baby boy filled the small bedroom. Mrs. Holloway cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing him in Catherine's arms. "He's strong," the midwife said, her usual brusqueness softened by the moment. "A fighter." Catherine looked down at the tiny face, perfect in every detail, and felt love bloom instantly in her chest. She carried the baby to Emily, who lay exhausted against the pillows. "Would you like to hold him?" Catherine asked gently. Emily hesitated before nodding. She took the bundle awkwardly, gazing down at the child with a mixture of wonder and sorrow. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "But he's not mine to keep." "You'll always be his first mother," Catherine said, sitting beside the bed. "We'll make sure he knows how much courage and love it took for you to give him this chance." Tears slipped down Emily's cheeks as she placed a gentle kiss on the baby's forehead before handing him back to Catherine. "Take care of him," she said softly. "Love him enough for both of us." 3 days later, with papers signed and witnessed by the sheriff and Mrs. Holloway, Thomas and Catherine took their son home to the cabin they shared. They named him Samuel, after Thomas's father, with the middle name James in honor of Catherine's father. The transition to parenthood wasn't without challenges. Samuel had colic for the first 2 months, leaving them bleary-eyed and exhausted. The construction on their new home had to be temporarily halted as funds were diverted to baby necessities. Catherine reduced her hours at the mercantile, relying more heavily on Sarah to manage day-to-day operations. Yet through it all, a deep joy permeated their lives, the kind that made even the most difficult days worthwhile. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, as comfortable rocking Samuel to sleep as he was breaking horses at the ranch. Catherine found that the maternal instincts she had feared might be lacking came naturally once Samuel was placed in her arms. On Samuel's first birthday, they hosted a small celebration at their newly completed home. Robert and Margaret brought their children, who had enthusiastically embraced their cousin. Sarah came from the mercantile, along with Sheriff Davis and, surprisingly, Mrs. Holloway. As Catherine served cake to their guests, she caught Thomas watching her from across the room, Samuel perched on his hip. The look in his eyes, pride, love, contentment, filled her with a happiness so complete it nearly brought tears. Later, as they put an exhausted Samuel to bed in his small room, Thomas wrapped his arms around Catherine from behind, both of them gazing down at their sleeping son. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" she asked, leaning back into his embrace. "For saying yes that day by the lake, for building this life with me, for showing me what family truly means." Catherine turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever regret it? Taking on a woman with my history, a child not of your blood?" Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his gaze steady and sure. "Catherine Irwin, not for one single moment. You and Samuel are the greatest blessings of my life." In that moment, standing in the soft lamplight of their son's bedroom, Catherine finally understood what Thomas had been trying to tell her all along. Her worth had never been determined by her ability to bear children, by the town's judgment, or even by her status as a wife. It came from within, from her courage, her resilience, her capacity for love. She had always been enough. In the years that followed, the Irwin family grew in unexpected ways. 2 years after Samuel's arrival, Mrs. Holloway once again approached them about a child in need, twin girls, whose mother had died in childbirth, and whose father, overwhelmed by grief and the prospect of raising 2 infants alone, had asked for help finding them a home. Thomas and Catherine welcomed Emma and Elizabeth into their family without hesitation, their home expanding to accommodate the growing brood. Samuel took to his role as big brother with pride, solemnly explaining the important rules of the household to his baby sisters. The mercantile continued to thrive, eventually becoming a true partnership between Catherine and Sarah, who had proven to have a keen business mind. Thomas and Robert expanded their ranching operation to include cattle drives to Los Angeles, increasing their prosperity while allowing Thomas to remain close to home most of the year. San Bernardino gradually changed its perception of Catherine. The woman once whispered about as barren and cursed became known instead for her successful business, her generous community support, and the loving home she and Thomas created for their children who, while not born of her body, were unmistakably hers in heart and spirit. In 1882, Catherine established a small fund at the church to assist women in difficult circumstances, particularly those facing motherhood alone or struggling with the loss of a child. The first donation came, to her surprise, from Mrs. Holloway, accompanied by a note that simply read, "You have taught this old woman that there are many ways to mother. Thank you." By the time Samuel turned 10, the Irwin home was known throughout the county as a haven for children in need. In addition to Samuel and the twins, they had taken in 2 more children permanently, a boy whose parents had been killed in a stagecoach accident, and a girl abandoned at the mercantile doorstep with nothing but a note, asking someone kind to care for her. They also regularly hosted children temporarily while permanent arrangements were made, earning Thomas and Catherine a reputation as people who could be counted on in a crisis involving a child. One evening in the autumn of 1888, with their permanent brood finally asleep and the house quiet, Catherine sat on the porch swing beside Thomas, a quilt wrapped around their shoulders against the cooling air. "Did you ever imagine this would be our life?" she asked, gesturing toward the large house with its many bedrooms, each occupied by a child with their own story of how they had become an Irwin. Thomas chuckled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Not specifically, no, but I always knew it would be extraordinary because you are." Catherine rested her head against his shoulder, contemplating the journey that had brought them here from her darkest days as a grieving, childless widow to this moment of profound fulfillment. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said softly. "Those women in town who mocked me for being barren, how they thought my life was over before it had really begun. Do you resent them still?" Thomas asked. Catherine shook her head. "No, I feel sorry for them in a way. Their view of womanhood, of motherhood, was so narrow. They couldn't see that there are countless ways to create a family, to leave a legacy." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Our legacy sits at that dinner table every night, 5 unique souls who will carry forward the love they've found in this home. 6, if you count the one we're expecting next month," Catherine added with a smile, thinking of the pregnant young widow from a neighboring town who had asked them to take her unborn child. 6 today, Thomas agreed. "Who knows how many tomorrow? Our family seems to have a way of growing when we least expect it." As darkness settled over the ranch and stars appeared in the clear sky above, Catherine reflected on the words Thomas had spoken to her that day by the lake, words that had changed the course of her life. "You are enough." In her darkest moments, she had believed her inability to bear children made her somehow incomplete, less of a woman, less worthy of love. What she had discovered instead was that her worth had never been dependent on what her body could or couldn't do. It resided in her capacity to love, to persevere, to create family in unexpected ways. The children who called her Mama might not share her blood, but they carried her values, her strength, her heart. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, noticing her thoughtful silence. Catherine turned to him, this man who had seen her true worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had never wavered in his belief in her. "I was thinking that you were right all those years ago. I am enough. We are enough. And somehow, that enough has multiplied into something far greater than I ever imagined possible." Thomas's smile in the moonlight was as warm and sure as it had been the day they met. "That, my love, is the miracle of choosing love over fear every single day." As they sat together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the family they had created, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that the journey, with all its pain and loss and unexpected joy, had led exactly where she was meant to be. The end.